So now, Josh, I'm going to hand over to you, the co-founder of One for the World, and he's going to tell us how it went from a crazy idea to donating $1 million to the most effective charities in the world.
Thank you very much, Jack. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I know, these are crazy times and it's a Friday afternoon and it's difficult to make time for a Zoom call. So thank you very much for your time today. Just before we get started, is it possible to get a sense? I mean, I definitely recognize some of the names on the dial-in here, which is really, really exciting. And thank you so much, guys, for joining. But is it possible to get a sense if just using our reactions on the Zoom, could anyone just give me a thumbs up if they're a current undergrad student? Awesome. Okay, this is very helpful. Really cool. And how about, could we get a clap if anyone's a current postgrad student? Excellent. Awesome stuff. Thanks, guys. And then I suppose the final question is, there was the suggestion that there might be a few kids here, or a few people here, sorry, from the Darden School at UVA, the business school at UVA. Can we get a thumbs up from the Darden crowd? I quite like the don't need to use the reactions, Pranav. That's awesome. Well, guys, thank you very much. Thanks all of you for joining me and taking the time out this afternoon. I'm really excited to give you a bit of background as to all of the things that have led us to this point at One for the World. So just a bit of background about myself. In my day job, I work for the private sector investment arm of the World Bank. So I'm based out of London, and I'm not one of the 3 staff members day to day at One for the World. But and I'm very glad to see that one of my colleagues has dialed in today, and I won't tell our manager that you've taken an hour off Friday afternoon, and it's our little secret, mate. But day to day I'm at the World Bank, but a few years ago I was involved in the founding of One for the World. And so I suppose the question for most of you, I think, that is, if you've ever sat there and wondered, you're struck trying to work out like what it is that you're going to do with your life, like just those big questions. And amongst that, you try, if you're sitting there and you're trying to think through, like, how am I going to make the world a better place? Like, what it is that I'm going to do. And for most people, we're not going to commit our entire lives to really extreme efforts in this regard, but we'd all like to do something, and we'd all like to make some commitment towards making our world a better place. And it was to that end that I was spending a lot of time thinking about this a few years ago when I was, or an increasingly long time ago actually, when I was a graduate student. And I think that, I was in a similar position to a lot of you guys that are studying now, both undergrads and the postgrads, that I was sitting on campus and I was trying to think through what my life was going to look like after graduation. And for those of you who aren't familiar with an American MBA, the idea is that you graduate from college or university and then you spend a few years working before returning to study. And I had I'd done a bit of consulting in Australia, but I'd spent the year and a half prior to going to Wharton working in West Africa, in Nigeria and Sierra Leone. In particular, I'd spent time working for Innovations for Poverty Action. And they do research they popularise the use of randomized controlled trials to demonstrate the efficacy of aid and policy interventions. And so I'd had exposure to work that demonstrated that people like myself now, like living in the Western world, can make a very real contribution to organisations making real change. And I was at Wharton. I was surrounded by people who were thoughtful and interesting. And I come from Sierra Leone, where GDP per capita on a purchasing power parity basis was about $1,800 a year. And now I was in America, where we would be spending $1,800 on full break quite comfortably. And I knew that there were things we could be doing, that I could be doing, and I was doing nothing. Like, I wasn't doing anything about it. I wasn't making any meaningful contribution to any organisation at the time. And I was having a wonderful time, obviously. For those of you who haven't been to business school, it's fantastic. And for those of you who are there now, I'm sorry that it's briefly interrupted by this coronavirus nonsense, but don't worry, I have every faith that the B School experience is going to come back with a vengeance in 2021. Like, it's all going to be okay. You'll make it all up. So I was having this wonderful time, and I was surrounded by quite thoughtful, interesting people. And one of the things that quite surprised me about business school was everyone was sort of deliberative, and they all had philanthropic aspirations. and no one, there was an extreme lack of finance douchebags, which is sort of the what the stereotypical bread and butter of an MBA program is. And so there was a lot of considered people and giving a lot of thought to what they wanted to do with their lives. But there wasn't a lot of conversation necessarily about giving. And despite having been quite privileged to have the experience of working for these organisations, where my job was literally like to organise quite expensive, very rigorous academic research into what works at alleviating poverty, I wasn't doing anything about alleviating poverty. And then I was stuck in this god-awful public speaking class. And at business school, when they're charging you $250,000, they call that strategic communications. But it's a public speaking class. And like when your only skill in life is talking, it was a bit of an affront. But at the end of this class, we had to give a speech, and we had to give a persuasive speech. And I happened to have just read this book called The Life You Can Save. And The Life You Can Save is a persuasive and inspiring work that will change the way you think about philanthropy. And it shows us that we can make a real profound difference in the lives of the world's poorest people. Or at least that's what Bill Gates said about the book. I also was quite impressed with it, and I'd recommend you read it. And because the world only gets better, I paid for that book and then read it with my own eyes. You can now listen to it for free in a podcast series, and Kristen Bell will read it to you. Anyway, so I'd read The Life You Could Save, and I was quite inspired, and I was really excited about it. And I sat down and I wrote this persuasive speech. And I sat there, as a classic unorganised student, I sat there most of the night and wrote this speech. And in it I said, I want to convince you to commit 1% of your future income to address abject poverty. And I said, ours can be the generation to finally eliminate the scourge of poverty. And I meant that literally. Like, this is ours, the first generation that could do that. And I said that the decisions we make have consequences. And you are in this moment capable of making a decision that will save lives and reduce the most crushing form of misery imaginable. And then I made this speech, and I was quite happy with it. I was quite excited about it. And then I did nothing. I suppose, at this point, we probably should talk for a moment about what we're talking about when we're talking about poverty, and in this instance, what we're talking about when we're talking about extreme poverty. So relative poverty exists in every country in the world, like even the richest countries in the world, the United States. There's still people who live in poverty, and that's really, it's terrible, and that's something that we'd definitely prefer to be without. But while I can say, but when I say GDP per capita in Sierra Leone was $1,800 a year, that's just a very boring way of saying that the average person lived on $1,800 for the entire year. And I think the obvious thing to say to that is, well, the things are cheaper in developing countries, so it probably goes further. But the purchasing power parity adjustment has already accounted for that. So quite literally what we're saying is, and I apologise for my work emails coming through on a Friday evening. Quite literally what we're saying is that imagine you and I catch a train into Penn Station in New York, and we walk out the front, and we walk out into 7th Avenue, and I turn to you and hand you $150. And I say to you, now live on this $150 for 30 days. That includes your accommodation, so you've got to rent something and you've got to pay for your food, and you've got to cover all of your costs. And it's so far beyond our comprehension that there's no meaningful way in which someone could actually attain this in the United States, right? Like, the material deprivation and the difference that we're talking about here is so substantial, it's actually impossible as a thought exercise. There's no way you'd go and say, oh, excuse me, I've only got $150 for the month, so can I rent a room in New York for $26, please? And so there is this giant gap between, and this is the median outcome in Sierra Leone. This is not an extreme outcome. And this is not an extreme country. And unfortunately, there's still 760 million people today who live on less than $1.90 a day. And I don't think...
Josh, can you just explain, because you mentioned it in passing, but what purchasing power parity is? Because I think that's super important in understanding why that's $1,800 at New York prices, not $1,800 in a totally different economy.
Yeah, and so it's an economic and international comparisons are difficult. So please allow for that. But it's an economic assessment of how far nominal GDP will go in a country, allowing for the fact that things are actually cheaper in emerging economies. So the nominal GDP in Sierra Leone per person is $505. So while it's north of $65,000 in the United States, it's less than 1/100th of that in Sierra Leone. The difference being that that $500 goes about 3.5 times as far, because labour is cheaper effectively, land is cheaper. And so what we're saying with the purchasing power parity is we're taking an amount and we're telling you what is its equivalent in US dollars or in international dollars, so that we can compare it to the actual lived experience of people in the United States. Now, the difficulty, of course, of that is that the gap is so large that we can't really quite comprehend it. And I think that the material deprivation part about this, the consumption component of poverty is extremely real. And those numbers are so large as to be difficult to comprehend, the 760 million people living on less than half a latte a day. But I think that the more you can still live a full and meaningful life without sort of much material wealth. I think that the starker inequalities in relation to health outcomes, and Jack spoke about these at the top of the call. So there's the World Health Organization estimates that 5.2 million children will die under the age of 5 today over the course of 2020, and that's 14,500 children a day, or a 747 crashing every hour, every day, all year. Now that's morbid and dark, but it's also very true. We're not talking about deaths from incurable cancers. We're talking about kids dying from malaria. And this is why the mosquito is the most deadly animal in the world. And this is why, as Kylie Jenner says, malaria is a motherfucker. Now, it's not going to kill you and I. If we were to get malaria, it would be a bad cold. I wouldn't advise getting malaria and then not realising and getting on a 36-hour flight to your younger brother's 21st birthday and thinking that you just had a bad hangover. But outside of that, malaria isn't going to be something that leads to terrible outcomes for us. But it's enough that, a lot of, just under 500,000 people will die this year. Most of those will be children under the age of 5. And it's an incredibly painful and upsetting way to watch someone pass away. And the saddest part about it is extremely addressable. Anyway, so this is the level of sort of, when we're talking about poverty, this is the level of poverty we're talking about. And I'd given my speech and I'd gone back to doing nothing. Anyway, Wharton being what it is, I then had a second public speaking class, and this was a persuasive speech. And you work on it for 6 weeks, and you know what I chose, right? I obviously chose marijuana legalization. And one of the other things we mentioned at the top of the call was randomized control trials. So I suppose it's just probably worth diving into that for 30 seconds. So when we want to know whether or not something has a particular impact, for instance, the coronavirus vaccine, the method for testing that is a randomized control trial. We break a group randomly into 2 or 3, 2 or more groups, and we give one group a treatment, here the vaccine, and another group gets the control group gets a placebo. The randomized control trials are the gold standard for demonstrating efficacy in drug development. It's why I'm not sure if you've seen the My Pillow CEO has a magic pill that's going to cure coronavirus. Now, if he wants to sell that as a pharmaceutical treatment to coronavirus, he would need to demonstrate to the FDA that he'd completed 3 randomized control trials, and then gone through a number of other things. Now, over the last couple of decades, a group of researchers have adopted that to field settings to test aid and policy interventions. And what they've demonstrated is that, there are any number of ways that you could try and ensure people didn't suffer from malaria. And some of those are hundreds of times more effective than others. Or there are any number of ways that you could try and increase attendance at schools. And I don't want to give away the punchline to a giving lunch conversation, but there are very different outcomes depending on the intervention you choose. And this research has been pretty radical in demonstrating that there are some really cheap ways of resolving some of the big issues in the world today. And the researchers involved won a Nobel Prize last year. Nobel Prize in economics. But anyway, I'm in my persuasive speech, and I'm in my persuasive speaking class, and I know all these things, and I'm going to talk about marijuana legalization. And thankfully, the night before the class, I came to the realization that absolutely no one cared about my opinion on marijuana legalization, but there was this issue that I was I was very passionate and motivated about. And so I wrote my speech and I gave it. At the end of the class, this woman, I didn't know much about her. She was quite forceful. It's about my height. She's wandered over to me. The one thing I did know, she'd arrived on campus and she'd so swiftly found herself in a relationship with one of the cutest second-year boys, which some of the second-year women had taken objection to at the time. And that's literally, this is my background on one of the more important relationships in my life. And Kate says to me, are you going to do this? This sounds like a cool idea. And I'm a business school student, so I give a business school answer, which is, oh, maybe I'd like to look into doing this. And, she cut me off and said, if you're serious about doing this, let's do it. I just don't really have time to stuff around. And thankfully, in that one instance, I managed to say, could we meet next Thursday? And I put something in her calendar, and we met in a very inauspicious meeting room, and we started what became One for the World. And so, that was how we got started. And I think from the point we got started, we have identified ourselves as part of the effective altruism movement. And so effective altruism is according to effectivealtruism.org, is about answering one simple question: how can we use our resources to help others the most? Will McCaskill, who was one of the co-founders of the movement, describes it as injecting science into the sentimental issue of doing good in the world. And so we've been looking to as aggressively as possible extract value from our donations since we were founded. And if you'd like to hear more about effective altruism, the next couple of speakers in our speaker series, Will McCaskill on October 2nd and Toby Ord, are incredibly steeped in this movement. It'll be very, very interesting. Like, I'm quite excited that we've got them as part of the One for the World speaker series, and we'll be joining you for them. But the next part of this process to getting One for the World off the ground was choosing organisations to support. And there's over 1.5 million non-profits in America, and we initially were recommending 4. And so with that in mind, it was a very difficult process, a lot of work to get that down to the organisations we would support. And thankfully, we were able to piggyback on the work of charity evaluators, and in particular, GiveWell, who spend over 20,000 hours a year trying to work out which are the organisations that do the most good. So we were looking for 2 specific things in each of the charities we supported. We wanted them to be doing an intervention that had been tested and rigorously shown to work at a really cost-effective basis. So anti-malarial bed nets are a really cheap way of preventing malaria. We talked about malaria earlier. It's just terrible and unnecessary. And then we need an organisation that's really good at effectively and cheaply implementing this. So the Against Malaria Foundation is radically transparent. Will tell you exactly which nets delivery that your donation leads to. You can check this out on the website. They're very cool. Even today, they have 8 staff, and they've delivered over 125 million bed nets around the world. So they're an awesome organisation. And these are the types of the groups that we were looking to work for. And I think that one of the things that we got very right was, in tech speak, I was the technical founder of a non-profit, but I've never, I came from a non-profit background, and Kate had come from a comms, marketing and strategy background. But I've never been involved in the selection of the charities at One for the World. We've been able to use the work at GiveWell, and we partnered very early on with a young a gentleman who is now Dr. Russell O'Keefe O'Donovan. He's the postdoctoral research fellow in economics at Oxford University and an assistant director of Global Priorities Institute at the University of Oxford. When I met him, we were drinking White Russians at a party in Philadelphia, and he was a graduate student. And we quickly identified that he was exactly the type of person that we needed to involve in an effort like this. And making sure that you lean on, wherever you can find it, technical support, like elite technical support like that is amazing, and something that I think one of the things that really resonates is having got correct early on at One for the World. But from that point forward, we had an organisation, and we worked out what we wanted to do. So we built a cheap and dependable process, or Kate built a cheap and dependable process for processing donations. We didn't have a track record at that point, and so without our own credibility, we worked with the National Philanthropic Trust, the largest operator in this space, and that, I think, piggybacking on other people's good name is something that definitely recommend in instances where you're trying to get started. We recruited a board, which included a guy who's now Instagram famous as Carrie Dragshaw. So check out @Dan Clay if you're interested and haven't already. He's wildly entertaining, and he interviewed Candice Bucknell the other night. We also recruited a team of student ambassadors. And so we wanted a broader base as possible to get the word out. And then we went and spoke to our fellow classmates, and we went and recruited them to give 1% of their future income to our group of highly effective charities as part of their broader philanthropic effort. And our pitch to them is similar to what it is still today, which is that ours is the first generation where we know there's a problem, we know there's a cost-effective solution, we can act with confidence, and this is solvable in our lifetime. It would take less than 1% of each of our incomes if globally we acted on this, and then we wouldn't have a world where we have the one plane full of children crashing every hour. And this is something that we can resolve, and we can take action on. And this isn't something that was open to my grandfather's generation. If you think about your grandparents, there was no way for them to log onto the internet and get great research on how to make the best value investment in their philanthropic dollar, and then give it away to organisations on the other side of the world. So we told this story, and we told each of them that we have an opportunity to quite regularly over the course of our working lives save someone else's life. So GiveWell estimate that the Against Malaria Foundation, it costs between $3,000 and $5,000 to save someone's life. And so if anyone on this call was to donate 1% of their income over the course of several years, you'd be almost guaranteed of making sure that there was someone alive that otherwise wouldn't have been, but for your effort. And this opportunity isn't open to everyone. The average person alive today makes somewhere just less than $3,000. So the average American is sort of making about 100 times more. And this means that a small fraction of our incomes, and I say this as I claim for the purposes of this conversation to be an American, but I'm not, obviously. But we have the opportunity with a small fraction of our income to make that difference regularly over the course of our working lives. And we spoke to people about this on campuses when we were students, and they said, I'm not sure I can afford it. Pretty sure, when you're a student, you're earning $0. I mean, I'm not sure, those of you who are currently students now, when you look forward to the future, I'm going to make money. And the difference between your paycheck and zero is going to be so large that the difference between 99% of your paycheck and 100% of your paycheck it's laughable from this vantage point. It's not laughable once you start spending it all and you've overcommitted your credit card. But if you make this active decision ahead of time, you're in a position to really make a contribution and make a change in other people's lives. So in our first year, we signed up 42 donors. The issue we had is that we couldn't take forward-dated donations. Our structure wasn't set up appropriately. Now today, if you go to the One for the Well website, you can make a donation that starts at any point in the next 4 years. So you can put your details in today for a donation that started in August 2024. If you're a freshman and you expect to graduate in 4 years' time, or you're a sophomore and you expect to graduate in 4 years' time, you can make a donation that starts in 4 years' time. We didn't have that, and it meant that our conversion rate on donations wasn't as high. And the next year, we were still on one campus. We were at Wharton, and we had our first pledge week. And this is how we now organise most of our giving drives on campuses all across the country. We're on about 75 campuses, law, med, MBA schools and undergrad programs around America, UK, Canada, and Australia. And we used this idea that was originated in 2015. We continue to run on volunteer labour for a number of years. But in 2017, we secured the support of the Life You Can Save, and they provided all of the operating costs that were currently or previously met by our board members. They provide us $10,000, which help us run the chapters and provide budget. And then in 2018, we hired our first staff member. We were kicked in the butt by our major funder in 2019 as to whether or not we were going to be serious about bringing on staff. And thankfully, we put together a proposal. I'm very happy to say that Jack is now our CEO, and we've got 3 staff members, including Kenan and Evan. So we've got 2 former chapter leaders on staff who've run One for the Well chapters as part of their undergrad experience, and are now full-time staff members. And so the organisation now is a much more professional operation, but it hasn't been so for very long. We've built this mostly on volunteer effort, and still even today, most of the labour that goes into One for the World, if you aggregated all of the effort of all of the chapter leaders across America, across Canada, across Australia and Britain, it is certainly outstrip our paid labour. Like, this is an organisation built on the support of people who believe in it. And so, we've got to the point now where we've raised nearly $1 million, and this is part of a series that we're celebrating the fact that we finally got there, and it's taken some time. The exciting part is the rate of growth, and we expect that we'll be celebrating $2 million a lot faster than we celebrated one. It took us about 4 years to get to $100,000 raised. I remember sending the email celebrating it, and it was really nice that 11 months later we got to $200,000 raised. So, if we can see this sort of growth in future, it'd be fantastic. Now, for those of you on the call today, I'm sure some of you have previously come across One for the World, and for those of you who haven't, thank you very much for joining us. We're really interested in your questions and your thoughts about the organisation. And our message to folks today is largely the same as it was in 2014. Is this the only way to make a difference in people's lives? It's certainly not. Does this compete with any other giving that you're part of? Definitely not. And I think the one thing to highlight is, and I'm not sure if I banged on about this enough earlier, is that it's really, really easy to do nothing. And it's really easy to do nothing when you're armed with all the information in the world. And we're not suggesting that anyone forego material comforts. We're not suggesting anyone stop holidaying. We're not saying stop drinking overpriced coffees. I mean, please don't take that away from me. We're not saying that you should stop drinking overpriced cocktails. We're not saying don't go to bougie fitness classes. We're not saying stop enjoying any of the wondrous material comforts of modern life. We are saying that, when you return to the workforce, and there'll be rainy days where you're like, what's this? For those of you who are currently undergraduate students, so I'm pretty sure you'll find time in your professional life. And I mean, just for anyone who is working, if you could just give me a thumbs up if you agree with this sentiment. There's just days when you go to work, you're like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? And what is it all for? And like, what is it like? What am I achieving? Like, why am I here? And on days like that, it's that we think that contributing to One for the World, thank you guys. I'm glad that there was some support for that one. I mean, if I'd been left hanging, it would have been rough. That it's on days like that we think One for the World enables you to make a real contribution every day. Like, and even on the days when like it's just a bit rough and things are a bit shit. And so I ended the first speech in that public speaking class that I didn't want to be in, and I said, we have a moral imperative to address this issue of absolute poverty. And you can do so without injuring your own interests. And you can do so without making a noticeable impact on your own life. And then I freely admit I did absolutely nothing. And if you're interested in actually saving a human life while still living an otherwise incredibly normal life yourself, normal, comfortable life yourself, it's almost as easy as doing nothing. But the outcome is extremely different. And it doesn't, it doesn't have to be a material, like a large change in your lifestyle. If you're interested, I'm going to email each of you at the end of the conversation today with a link to take the pledge, and there'll be, if you're interested in learning more, we're going to do a series of giving lunches. We'd love for you to participate, and we'll donate $10 to any charity that you choose for doing so. But thank you very much for taking the time for joining today. I'd absolutely love to answer all of your questions and anything that anyone would like to know about One for the World, how we got here, and what we're trying to do.
Well, Josh, thanks so much for a wonderful talk. I've seen you talk a number of times in person, and I have to say it was almost as good over Zoom. So that's pretty hard to do, and thanks a lot for that. So we've got a few questions coming in the chat that I'd like to draw your attention to. So Julian has a question about this 747s analogy. He's asking that keeping these 747s in the air, so to say, is a brilliant result. But for the poorest countries in the world, mostly in Central and Southern Africa, eventually this might lead to even more pressure on what we might call underperforming institutions. So does One for the World consider at all branching away from extreme poverty relief at some point? Or, you know, as the founder, do you think we're better off sticking with what we do best?
It's a very good question. And I believe that question has been written from a gentleman sitting in the Central African Republic himself, and who earns a crust as a prosecutor of international criminals. So it's a particularly hard-hitting question, knowing the source, but it's a good one. So I think the most pressing part of this issue is that ensuring that families are safe and have comfort that their children are going to live through adolescence is one of the best ways that we can ensure that we provide comfort to people, that leads to a more moderate population growth, that leads to less pressure on institutions. It leads to us not having to. You can imagine that, like, not only is a death a tragedy, but it is also a loss of investment in human capital and effort and resources that have gone into each and every individual, and rightly so. And so I think that the more pressing issue here is that we're in a world where we don't unnecessarily see suffering that's so extreme that people die for want of very, very basic interventions, and that does. And fantastically, that does create second order concerns. So for a brief period of time, that would mean that there are more secondary school students. And then it will mean that there's a boom of people who enter the workforce at the same time. But those second order concerns, while very real, are offset by the fact that a young and healthy populace is a giant benefit for people to have. And I think it's quite possible that, hopefully, at some point in the not too distant future, the most pressing and easiest issues to resolve in the world won't be children under the age of 5 dying absolutely unnecessarily. So that would be a great outcome. If that's not the cheapest and easiest problem to solve, like the really sad part about this is how easy it is to solve. We're talking about the cost of $3,000 to $5,000. It's just absolutely absurd that that's what's involved in keeping someone alive that was otherwise going to not make it. And so I can't see One for the World in the immediate term moving too far away from the fact that we've got this giant problem. We'd like to be part of the resolution. The situation does get better year to year. Coronavirus might have unfortunately put us back slightly, but I think that collectively, we're seeing movement in the right direction. Our World in Data is a great source of information about this for anyone that's interested, and you can get a real sense. So last year was the first year in recorded history that malaria deaths were below 500,000, and that's a fantastic outcome. And the work of organisations like the organisations we support, Against Malaria Foundation, their 125 million nets make a real contribution to that.
Thanks, Josh. And thanks, Julian, for the question. Please, by all means, if you have questions for Josh before we wrap this up, drop them in the chat, or you can send them to me directly. I've got a question here from one of our chapter leaders who's working on opening up a new chapter this semester. You talked a little bit about Kate, whom I know to be a force of nature. And this chapter leader wants to know, how important are co-founders, and what do you think the trajectory of the org would have been had you went about this on your own?
Okay, so the second, let's answer the easy part here. We're here for easy solutions to easy problems. This organisation would not exist, wouldn't have gone anywhere, would still be an idea kicking around in my head that probably should have happened, but for the intervention of Kate Epstein. And so we would have gone absolutely nowhere without Kate, that is for sure. And so, maybe there's a 1 in 100 chance that I would have got it off the ground myself. But I do think that when you're trying to create something new on campus, when you're trying to do something difficult, finding support and someone to work with you is exceedingly important. And the most important and the most impactful relationship will be the first one. And so this is why we're still always looking for chapter leaders to find co-founders. It just makes life a lot easier. Now, there have been some phenomenal chapter leaders who've got things done themselves. One-man show or one-woman show has really got things off the ground. But as a general rule, it's just so valuable to have someone else on board. And I think we made a number of mistakes in the scaling up of One for the World. We would have been here faster, and we would have raised more money already if we got more things right. we've got and to give them ownership and to get involved and passionate about the organisation. And from when Kate and I started, I think we've done a reasonable job of that. And there's now, like, it's really exciting just how many people who have been involved as chapter leaders and graduated, who sat on our board at various points over the last 6 years, are 3 excellent full-time staff members, but also the broader base of support around them. And so it is. I mean, getting a chapter off the ground is like really difficult work, and nothing has, I suppose, been as hard since then as that, as getting the first chapter off the ground. There was definitely been points where things haven't gone how we might have liked, but it's still really hard work. And to the degree that you can find someone that you're excited to work with that gets things done, and I think that's the core differentiator for successful chapters is, are the co-founding team good at getting things done? Then I would highly recommend that you do that as part of founding the organisation on campus. But I will say that you'll end up with the group of people that you found that chapter with and that you work with over the course of the next year or two. You'll end up continuing to be in conversation with them. They'll be in your life for years and years to come. So it was 7 years later, and I was at Kate. One of the last things before coronavirus ruined 2020. One of the last great things I got to do was go to Kate's wedding in New York, and that's these are the kind of relationships that are built on the back of putting in yards, creating an organisation for change on your campus.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And my co-president from my time at Columbia is still very close to me, and I couldn't have done what we did without her. So I just want to double down on that. A question here from Pranav. How do donors get updated on the impact they're having through One for the World?
That is a great question, Pranav. And I think, Kenan, you're almost better placed to answer this than I am, because we now do very good impact reports and you author them. So, Kenan, do you mind me handing this one over to you for 2 seconds?
Not at all. Yeah, so this is a great question, and it's really important to us to really connect donors directly with the impact they're having. So what we do is we take the disbursements that your donations come out to the various charities you're supporting, and once a quarter we send out impact reports detailing exactly the impact you've had based on the allocation, the donation amount, and GiveWell's cost effectiveness estimates. So if you had donated $433 through Against Malaria Foundation, that comes out to 100 bed nets purchased, distributed, and monitored. And we send those out, as I said, once a quarter. If you're a prospective donor, so you're someone who's taken the pledge and it doesn't start yet, what you'll see instead in your impact report is the yearly impact of your pledge once it activates. But great question. We're constantly working to try to make the impact feel a little more tangible. So we're working in some recipient stories from partner charities like Give Directly. And as a One for the World donor, this is one of the values that you can expect by being part of our movement. And yes, you can check the chat for our impact calculator hosted on our website. Okay, we've got some more questions here for you, Josh. This one from another chapter leader, Maggie at NYU, who is also a business school student. She wants to know, when you were in B school, how did you appeal to your peers who are caught up with the recruitment process and focused pretty singularly on their career prospects without really, they don't visibly seem to be concerned with problems in the other part of the world? How did you approach that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I do think that one of the things that we've got better at is structuring our asks around the calendar of students and the communities that we're working in. Obviously, with MBAs and I'm not sure, for those of you who are undergrads, I'm not sure if it's a similar cycle, that a lot of the recruiting happens around sort of September, October of each year, and that's when people will find out if they've got offers. And so that allows us to run a pledge week post the efforts of people, when people have some more comfort around their future employment. I mean, the other thing though that I would point to, and this is a question coming from NYU, right? Like, check out the NYU employment report. It's outrageous. So if people are worried about or are stressed in the moment about their outcomes, I think it's really normal to point them towards, or comforting almost to point them towards the fact that everything's going to be pretty good for an NYU grad. And there is enough space I think there's enough space in everyone's life for a conversation about what you'd like life to be upon graduation. And the outcomes that can be reasonably expected by your classmates are pretty fantastic. We can try and make explicit asks around offers, calendars. That's fantastic. But the results that people are expecting are a bit outrageous.
Great. Thanks, Josh. I've got another one here, a very poignant question, and certainly one I think about a lot. So how does One for the World think about the role of race in its work and leadership? Most of the work that our charities do happens in the Global South, but it appears, and certainly is the case, that the leadership is mostly white and Western. So how does the organization grapple with that, and where do you see gaps as a result? And do you have any vision for changing representation and leadership in the longer term?
That's a great question. So this is obviously something that has been top of mind, and I mean, Jack, you might want to jump in here about some of the plans that you have around our future hiring. We're a very small organisation when it comes to our paid staff, but you'll notice that we have 3 white men on payroll, and we are very aware of that. The organisation, by its sort of very nature, will be a lot of, we're asking donors in the Western world to support what we think are global priorities. So we think that the last universal thing that we can all agree on is that children under the age of 5 shouldn't die unnecessarily. So while there are so many things that are at this point quite controversial in our world, I don't think I've ever heard a liberal say, "Oh no, that we need to defer to the agency of that child under 5 to choose whether or not they want to partake in an intervention." And I've never heard a conservative suggest that a 4-year-old needs to lift themselves up by their own bootstraps. So the outcomes we're looking for are universal outcomes, we feel. We're very aware of the fact that, and our donor base will typically, at this point, it'll include a lot of people in the Western world. Now, we definitely have a diverse group of donors, and while our board is less diverse than it ideally would be, I think we're not in the situation we are with our employment here. But it's something that is, we need to be very aware of the communities we're operating in. What we're looking to do is funnel money to organisations that operate and have a licence to operate in the Global South, and do so extremely effectively. So our organisation should reflect we should reflect the society we're operating in, and it probably doesn't do that it doesn't do that to the degree we want it to at this point, and we'll look to address that over time at both the staff and board level. But there is an element of I don't think we can correct for the fact that our donor base is going to be majority Western, or folks in Western countries, and I think that is that's the basis for where what we're trying to do is make these issues pertinent to a group of people who enjoy a level of material comfort that enables them to participate. But yeah, it's a very good question. It's something that we are very aware of.
If I can just jump in here as well, that is a really excellent question. And I just want to talk very quickly about some concrete things that we're doing, because we absolutely have to do better in terms of the diversity of our staff team and our board. So the first thing is that we are offering paid internships now for people who are still at university. And the idea behind that is to make sure that a diverse group of candidates from a diverse group of backgrounds can get experience of working at One for the World. And that is where we anticipate hiring our future staff from. So Evan and Kenan obviously ran chapters before. We have a fantastically diverse group of chapter leaders, and it isn't good enough that our staff team and our board don't reflect that diversity. But I think a key barrier to particularly people who are not from privileged backgrounds is, if you can only do unpaid internships, how do you ever get a foot through the door? So we got rid of that this summer, and all of our interns are paid $15 an hour, which we think is competitive. Secondly, we've raised the entry-level salary in One for the World by 25% in the middle of last year, and started offering comprehensive healthcare with no copays and no deductibles. So again, that's in the same spirit, but I was thinking, well, why is it that the applications we've had haven't had many candidates of color? They haven't had people who have not gone to elite schools. Why is that? Well, I think a big part of that is, if you're asking people to live in a high cost of living city, you need to pay them enough that they don't need to have other wealth behind them in order to be able to do that. And then I think the third thing is much more difficult, which is, how do we do concrete outreach to a diverse community of people, so that when we are sifting through applications, we're not looking at 8 applications from white people and 1 candidate of color. And that, I think, is harder, but that's where I see our chapter leaders doing a really amazing job for us, because they are our best advocates and they are extremely diverse, and that's where I see our talent coming from. So I'm hoping that we can have more of a structured pipeline, so that by the time we're hiring, we have an amazing slate of candidates to choose from and can do better on that. The really hard part for me is not only how do we get a diverse group within our US and kind of, Australia, Canada, UK operation, but how do we ensure the representation of the beneficiaries of the charities that we work with? And the truth is that I don't think anyone has a good answer for that right now. The best is Give Directly, who have a director of recipient advocacy, Caroline Tetty, who is based in one of the countries where they work, and is a fantastic person. And I really would encourage you to see the webinar she did with us last summer. But that is an ongoing challenge in the development sector, and I'd be lying if I said we had an easy answer to that. So thank you for that question.
Thanks. So I have another question here from another one of our chapter leaders who wants to know, this is Charlie at Northwestern, or excuse me, this is Charlie not at Northwestern, who wants to know, what's the best way to help people overcome inertia and take that first step in effective giving? Is it coming to one of our giving lunches? Is it coming to a One for the World event? How do we get their foot in the door?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so when we work out the definitive answer to this, Charlie, we are going to print it on every email that we write for 3 or 4 years. But I think we want people to engage with this idea over time. Like, you can't walk up to someone and say, I've got this great idea and you should donate 1% of your income for all of time to these organizations because I think it's great. And so we need to, over the course of your classmates and your time on campus, we need a ladder of engagement where we introduce people to One for the World, the ideas of effective giving. We need to support their efforts to get up, become more aware of what it is we're doing, what it is the organizations we support are doing. And I think, and my hunch is, and it's very open to critical assessment, and it's certainly open to review on the data. So please come at me with the real answer, guys, if you've got something that you would disagree. But I think that information sessions and speakers, especially speakers that aren't directly related to One for the World, where we can provide an introduction to the organisation while also delivering excellent, interesting content that's pro-social. It's about a speaker that's about making the world a better place, but not necessarily about effective giving and giving 1% of your income to a particular set of charities. I think that's probably the easiest way to get people's foot in the door and introduce these concepts in sort of a non-confrontational way, where we're not making a direct ask on people, where it's an opportunity to learn more. I think that's probably the best way to get people's foot in the door. But at the same time, there are people every year who have a 5-minute conversation at a table during Pledge Week and then sign up and give consistently over time. So we don't have a great answer. When you've got a better answer, let us know. Like, as you find out more information and you feel better about what works, this is something that we're constantly iterating, is how do we introduce people to this idea? We think there are tens of millions of people across the US who are latent One for the World donors who don't know it, and we just need to introduce this idea to them. And so how do we go about that in an effective way is it's an open question and something that we continue to work on.
Thanks, Josh. And yeah, it's certainly more of an art than a science right now. But for all the chapter leaders on the call, we're looking to you to help us gather more data on that. So Josh, I just want to say thanks so much for your time. Thanks everyone for submitting questions. I'm going to turn it over to Jack to wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. And to reiterate, Josh, fantastic job. Thank you. We really appreciate you being with us. And to everyone who joined, we really appreciate you giving up some time on your Friday, and the questions were acute and really helpful to help all of us understand the organization better and what we're trying to do. What should you do now? There are 3 things that you should do now, and I'm going to list them in order of importance. If you are interested in taking the pledge, go to our website. You can read all about it. You can calculate your prospective impact, and you can take the pledge right now and start saving lives today. So please, 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 if what you've heard sounds interesting to you and you understand the logic of what we're trying to do, please, please, please go onto our website and take the pledge. The second thing that you can do is sign up for a giving lunch. This is a lunch where we spend 30 minutes. It's very interactive. It's not a lecture, talking to you, understanding about your approach to giving, explaining some of our approach to giving. And if you turn up to one of those, we will give $10 to any charity that you want, even rubbish ones that we don't approve of. We will give them $10 in order to get you into a giving lunch. I promise. I will personally donate to Stanford's endowment fund so that $10 is added to their $30 billion endowment fund if you turn up to a giving lunch. I promise you it's true. And the third thing you should do is tell a friend, because we have a load more webinars coming up. We have some internationally renowned speakers. We have Chloe Coburn joining us to talk about BLM and effective giving, which I, for one, am super excited about because I have no idea what she's going to say. So those are the 3 things. Take the pledge, come to a giving lunch, and tell a friend about the webinar series. But with that, thank you very much. Thank you again to Josh, and we will see you all in a couple of